Good afternoon. I am Midshipman First Class Conrad Davis, and I have the honor of introducing this panel's moderator, Admiral Winnefeld, and its topic, Rebuilding the Defense Industrial Base. Admiral James Winnefeld, U.S. Navy retired, commissioned through Naval ROTC at the Georgia Institute of Technology in 1978, and began his naval service flying the F-14 Tomcat. After Fighter Squadron Command, he commanded USS Cleveland and the USS Enterprise. He also led the Theodore Roosevelt Carrier Strike Group while it was conducting operations in support of our troops in Iraq. Later, he commanded NATO Joint Command Lisbon, Striking and Support Forces NATO, and the United States Sixth Fleet. After serving as the Joint Staff Director of Strategic Plans and Policy, he assumed command of the United States Northern Command and North American Aerospace Defense Command. He retired from military service in 2015 after 4 years serving as the 9th Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the nation's #2 ranking military officer, for a total of 37 years of service. Since 2022, he has served as the chair of the President's Intelligence Advisory Board. He is also an author, distinguished professor at Georgia Tech, non-resident senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School, and serves on several board and advisory positions in industry. This panel will explore the critical challenges facing the U.S. defense industrial base, from aging infrastructure to supply chain vulnerabilities and the challenges to producing weapon systems, platforms, and components in light of climate change and global instabilities. Our goal today is to gain insights from industry experts on how to revitalize our arsenal of democracy. Ladies and gentlemen, Admiral Winnefeld. Thanks, sir.
Drill deck voice.
My outdoor voice is saying, welcome to the Jack C. Taylor Conference Center. What a beautiful place the Naval Institute has put together. And welcome to our panel today. I'm really looking forward to this. And we're here for a very important reason. The U.S. defense industrial base is currently facing enormous challenges, from aging infrastructure to supply chain vulnerabilities to shortages of skilled labor to inflation and good old-fashioned funding shortages. It's affecting our ability to both produce platforms and payloads, weapons, what have you. It's all happening at a time of enormous turbulence across the globe. Still not. Oh, is it working now?
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. It's happening at a time of enormous turbulence across the globe, and as U.S. global leadership is being tested by a host of adversaries. The Navy is feeling the mismatch between its stated needs, 381 ships, for example, and its ability to produce and maintain them. Meanwhile, defense contractors are dealing with the trend towards things like fixed-price contracts that are making things very challenging for them financially. Just ask Boeing. We have a terrific panel lined up to discuss some of these issues. I'm going to ask each of them a question. They're going to have a good chance to express their views, and then we'll turn it over to the audience to answer some of your questions. And I'm going to introduce the panel now. We have Dr. Cynthia Cook, who's the Director, Defense Industrial Initiatives Group and Senior Fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, International Security Program. Thank you. We have Mr. Mark Adelson, who's the Naval Facilities Engineering Systems Command Program Executive for Industrial Infrastructure. We have Mr. Luke A. Nicastro, who is an analyst in U.S. defense infrastructure policy at the Congressional Research Service. And our industry rep and former NAVC commander, Vice Admiral Tom Moore, who after serving 39 years in the Navy, joined Huntington Ingalls as Corporate Vice President of Customer Affairs. And joining us shortly will be Carla Zeppieri, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Industrial Base Resilience. So I can't think of a better combination of panelists from across the board to talk about this very, very important subject. And I want to start with Cynthia. And I'm going to ask you, you have argued that an ecosystem approach is necessary to address this industrial-based challenge. Can you share what you mean by that? And what's the nature of that challenge, and what should our response be?
Thank you. Can you hear me, or should I pick up the mic? Okay. All right. How about now? I could hear you fine the whole time, by the way. So thank you, everybody, for coming to this event today, and thank you for that kind introduction. I have been working on industrial base issues for over 25 years as an acquisition analyst. And really the inspiring thing that I've seen now is that we finally have the right kind of focus on it. We have it for worrisome reasons, the challenges in supporting Ukraine in its self-defense. But at last there's focus. So I think I want to talk about three important themes to get us going, and that will sort of shape the considerations that need to underpin the response. So the first theme I want to talk about, the first consideration, is the changing nature of the threat, which is what DoD will need to be prepared for. The idea of a quick and decisive strike with shock and awe, cowing our adversaries into submission, is very compelling, but it's much less salient given the challenges we are facing today, and we really have to prepare for that. Russia tried that with its strike into Ukraine, and 3 years later, nearly 3 years, we're still facing the longest land war that Europe's seen in decades, with the sides battling over inches of territory. Ukraine, Gaza's also taking much longer than it is dragging on, and also the lessons from OEF and OIF, which were definitely protracted wars. So if there's a future conflict, the evidence suggests that that's what we need to prepare for, and the industrial base has not been stood up to respond to that. Reports in The Economist suggest that China is investing its stockpiles of materiel. Industrial base analyses demonstrates that they really are working at a wartime economy. So we see this threat, but the question is, what's next? We need to prepare for protracted war, and we just haven't responded quite yet. The good news is that there are definitely signs that the industrial base is awakening. The chairman is aware of this and has given remarks about it. The Department of Defense has Dr. Laura Taylor Collet, who is the first ever Assistant Secretary of Defense for Industrial Base Policy, and she's issued the National Defense Industrial Strategy, which has 4 themes of supply chain resilience, workforce, acquisition flexibility, and working with allies and partners. The Regional Sustainment Framework is looking at conducting maintenance, repair, and overhaul with allies and partners. The ASALT, Doug Bush, has reinvigorated the Army's munitions enterprise. The CHIPS Act is supporting the onshoring of semiconductor manufacturing. So there are a lot of efforts underway. So that's the good news. But that said, the evidence shows that we're not quite where we need to be yet. What do we need to do today so that we don't have any regrets in 3 years and 5 years and however many years it will be before we're at war? But more importantly, what do we invest in today to deter that conflict, to deter our adversaries from picking fights? We need to go beyond a narrow vision of fixing the industrial base and return to the concept of resilience, which can be defined as incorporating military capacity, civil preparedness, and emergency planning, a concept that was central to the Cold War narrative as a first line of defense against the Soviet Union, and is really something that we need to think about now. What is a whole of economy approach going to look like? We don't need that approach right now, but we need to start thinking about the planning for that. So with that, I will turn it over back to
Thank you very much.
Admiral, and we will continue.
All right, Luke, from your perspective at the Congressional Research Service, what do you see as the most important developments and trends shaping America's industrial base? What should policymakers be thinking about as we plan for the mid and long term? And if you're able to answer, what do you think Congress's role is going to be, this deeply divided and incredibly complex animal we call the United States Congress? How are they going to approach this problem?
So you have the hard questions.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the question. Obviously, or questions, I should say. Obviously, there are a huge number of issues and trends that we could talk about that are shaping the U.S. defense industrial base. I sort of wanted to highlight just 4 of what I think are some of the most significant. The first of those is that we have a situation today where both inside and outside Washington, there is more interest in the condition of the U.S. defense industrial base than at any point since the end of the Cold War, right? And as Dr. Cook said, Cynthia, that is perhaps for worrisome reasons, but it is a change, right? It is a fact, and that concern is driven by geopolitics, right? Anybody who takes even a cursory look at the news can see the extent to which great power rivalries are shaping the international landscape. There's the presentation. So got some graphics to perhaps help us along. So the geopolitics, you can see developments like the Russian invasion of Ukraine, intensifying strategic competition with China, turmoil in the Middle East. I mean, all of these things, I think, have really underscored the idea that being able to fight and win an industrial scale war is critical to U.S. national security. I think there's also a broad economic development I would be remiss not to mention, which is that if you look at the past 4 decades and what you could describe as the decline of the domestic manufacturing sector, I think that's convinced a lot of people that robust policy interventions are necessary if we are going to have an industrial base that can meet the nation's defense requirements. I should also note on the topic of this interest that it encompasses both privately owned capacity, so the commercial defense industry, as well as publicly owned capacity, what's often referred to as the organic industrial base, right? Government-owned plants and arsenals and shipyards. So that interest is in turn feeding this second trend, which is dramatically increased use of DIB-related authorities, programs, and funding, right? And these tools have been put to 3 broad purposes, at least, right? The first of these, expanding production. A really good example of this is the Defense Production Act, particularly Title III, which is a way for the U.S. government to provide direct financial assistance to U.S. suppliers. There's been unprecedented usage of this authority and unprecedented appropriations to fund it, at least under peacetime conditions, right? This second purpose, increasing innovation, you can see this in organizations like the Defense Innovation Unit and the newly stood up Office of Strategic Capital, which represent different kinds of attempts to bring in more innovation to the defense industrial base. And then finally, looking at streamlining acquisition, there is much greater use of non-traditional approaches to acquisition, things like other transaction authorities, for instance, or multi-year procurement authority for munitions, which traditionally did not have that kind of authority. So, this is a major trend, particularly over the last 5 years, right? A third trend to highlight here, the expanding international role of the DIB. U.S. suppliers are making more weapons and munitions for non-U.S. use than at any point since the Second World War, right? And a lot of this, the lion's share is driven by Ukraine, right? We're producing weapons both to directly provide to the Ukrainian military through the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative. We're also producing a lot to replace items that we have already sent through things like the Presidential Drawdown Authority. And in addition to Ukraine, you obviously have other recipients of U.S. security assistance like Taiwan and Israel, pretty high-profile examples. And then beyond security assistance, there's another piece to this story, which is an increase in industrial cooperation, co-production, joint RDT&E projects, joint sustainment efforts. Probably the biggest example of this is the AUKUS partnership, right? Both Pillar 1, which is submarine-focused, and Pillar 2, advanced capabilities, so it's sort of a suite of defense technologies. You also have some efforts that are happening through things like the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, the NATO National Armaments Directors meetings, and the recently stood up Partnership for Indo-Pacific Industrial Resilience. So there is a lot happening in the international space. The final trend I wanted to highlight that's kind of shaping the DIB today, changes among defense suppliers, right? So the defense ecosystem is still dominated by what you could call legacy primes, particularly the big 5, right? Lockheed, Boeing, RTX, Northrop Grumman, and General Dynamics. But that is changing somewhat. There are newer entrants to the scene, companies like Palantir, Anduril, Shield AI. There is increasing involvement from venture capital and private equity. And it still constitutes a relatively small share of the DIB if you measure by things like contract obligations. But there is a lot of private investment that is going into these kinds of companies, and it is a dynamic that looks likely to continue to change the way that the DIB is structured. And the final point I wanted to raise on this particular development, the government is putting a lot of money into organic industrial base facilities, right? That publicly owned capacity. The Army has its Organic Industrial Base Modernization Plan, which is a 15-year plan to address all 23 of their industrial facilities. The Navy has the Shipyard Infrastructure Optimization Program, which is doing a similar thing for the 4 public shipyards. So again, this is definitely a change from the situation, especially prior to 2020, right? Finally, I'm not going to go through all of these, but as far as the second part of your question, sort of what should policymakers be thinking about? So at the Congressional Research Service, right, we don't do advocacy. We tend to do less satisfying things like raise questions. So, there are sort of 2 broad categories of questions that I think are worth thinking about here. One category concerns sort of end states, right? These are big picture questions about what we want the DIB to look like. How much capacity do we really think we need? What is the right balance between privately owned capacity and publicly owned capacity? How reliant should we be on non-US sources, right? We hear a lot about ally shoring and friend shoring, right? What is the real role and what is the trade-off? What is the trade-off there between that and onshoring, right? And then the role of competition in the private defense industry, consolidation, right? These are trends that have attracted considerable sort of anxiety and notice. And what degree of government regulation is appropriate, right? So these are kind of the big picture questions. You've also got then sort of follow-on questions about ways and means. How do you do that, right? How much money exactly? What programs specifically? And then as far as the congressional role, I mean, obviously appropriations, resourcing, I mean, that is, the major role here is that, ultimately the hundreds, the thousands of procurement and RDT&E decisions and industrial base-wide investment decisions that Congress makes are the most important factor in determining the overall shape of the industrial base. So there is a major, major role for Congress here. And I think I'll leave it at that and hand it back to the moderator.
And you're going to and I'm sure that when you hand that excellent analysis off to the sausage-making factory, that member interests don't play any role whatsoever.
None at all, none at all.
All right, Carla, thank you for sprinting out here on the most highly funded department in the U.S. government has a hard time finding transportation, right?
Yeah, evidently executive transportation, when there aren't enough drivers, means you have to go and pick up a car at their office, and it actually takes even longer than it does to rent a car these days when you would just walk up and get your keys. Yeah.
So any of you who are longing to go back into government, just remember that. Okay.
Not a stellar experience this morning, so my apologies.
No worries at all. You got here just in time, because I'm going to ask you your question, which is your job as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Infrastructure Resilience is a lot more than what that title sounds, from reading your job description. It has to do with assessing the health of the defense industrial base and then making recommendations on policy, investments, choices that can be made. So you're sort of in the chapeau of the department. So tell us, what is your view? What is your assessment of the industrial base as we're looking at it now? And what are the sort of big picture recommendations that you all are looking at or actually making?
Okay. Right. Well, again, thank you, and my apologies for being late. As you mentioned, I lead the industrial base resilience team. We're part of industrial base policy led by Dr. Laura Taylor-Collet, who I think I heard maybe Dr. Cook mention while I was trying to get mic'd up. And then, of course, we are one of the 5 verticals under acquisition and sustainment. So we work closely with our colleagues in acquisition, sustainment, environmental, and installations, et cetera. But our organization, I don't know if this was mentioned at the get-go, but industrial-based policy as an ASD, Assistant Secretary of Defense-led organization is a relatively new creation, right? DoD is not, it's not like the Defense Department hasn't been thinking about industrial-based issues for decades, but traditionally it was led actually at my level, right, at a Deputy Assistant Secretary level, and then Congress mandated that the department elevate it to an ASD level, just given some of the things that were being hit upon, right, that this industrial-based policy writ large has really garnered significant attention, this administration and the previous administration, I would say, right, building on that work. So in my organization, in industrial-based resilience, I have 2 halves of the organization. One is the policy and analysis team, who are doing, as the name would indicate, analysis and making policy recommendations with regard to industrial-based resilience. The other half of it is the investment team, and there we use 2 of DoD's really powerful tools for industrial-based investment, which are the Defense Production Act, specifically Title III, but not exclusively. We exercise DoD's authorities under Title I and Title III of the Defense Production Act, And then we also have the industrial base analysis and sustainment account, which is an RDT&E account. So between DPA and IBAS, we have been able to assist the department working in concert with the services, frankly, to invest where they cannot in some cross-cutting capabilities. One of our major tasks right now as an organization, and this is, at my boss's level, even though my team is doing a lot of the compilation work, we are working right now to publish a unclassified version of an implementation plan for the National Defense Industrial Strategy, which of course was released at the beginning of this calendar year. DoD's first ever defense industrial strategy of its kind. So now we are working across the department and with our interagency partners to develop an implementation plan to ensure that a strategy just doesn't sit on the shelf as a nice glossy book, but that we're actually putting it into action and going to be tracking progress as to how we are mitigating risk in the defense industrial base. But that's a pretty large task because even though I just mentioned from IBR, we do have these two very powerful investment tools. We can't do everything ourselves. Even OSD cannot do everything. I mean, as everyone here knows, and I'm sure the audience is aware, I mean, a lot of those, the funding and the resources are going to come from the military departments, and so we need to work in concert with them to make this plan a reality. So just to hit a little more closer on your question, although I don't want to take too long, this first iteration of the implementation plan is organized around 6 initiatives that DoD leadership decided after talking with the rest of the department, our industry partners, of course, international allies and partners, that these were should be the most urgent issues that we need to get after, that are also should have kind of the highest payoff for the department and the health of the DIB in the near to midterm. I mean, there will be some tasks in there that will be longer term tasks, but we were trying to keep this first implementation plan and the tasks we get after, as things that can be accomplished within the next 5 to 6 years.
Okay. So thank you, Carla. Carla just walked us through sort of the macro department-wide level thing. So I want to turn to Mark. You have responsibility for industrial infrastructure for the Navy. What prompted the need for the shipyard infrastructure optimization program, and how's that going to improve the Navy's defense industrial base?
Sure, thanks, sir. I appreciate the offer and to be here, and thanks to the Navy Institute for having me. And maybe I can bring it right, why we need to do it, the framework. We got some theory and some policy helping us. I get to be the executor of this, but since it is a history conference, so let's see if whose slides I'm briefing today. There we go. We got to remember that this really is the story of the industrial base of the United States in the shipyards. Now, we built our shipyards in the First World War and the Second World War, right, to build steamships, sailing ships in some cases. The youngest of them has been around since 1908 and have served us well through multiple years, but they're getting tired. Now, the difficulty is when you come to these things, if you have that marginal dollar, right, we're always, my favorite phrase is always, you're going to take risk ashore. Put it to the plane, put it to the nuclear submarine, absolutely. But eventually that peace dividend becomes a peace loan, and it's time to start repaying that thing. And that's what the Organic Industrial Base Rebuild and specifically SIOP, Shipyard Infrastructure Optimization Program, is to do. The Navy has made that commitment, huge backing from Congress to be able to do that, to say, hey, we've got to do something about it. We're real proud of what we did in the past, but it was in a different era. We have 37,000 people come to work on the shipyards each day. The buildings may be beautiful, but it's probably not the first place you want to work. When you look at these very airy structures, seismic code didn't exist when we built these things. Heck, for that matter, NEPA didn't exist, OSHA didn't exist. So we're rebuilding them in a whole different time now. The good news, though, is we're starting to get after it. And I say it's the story of the industrial base because it's both the Navy's ability to recapitalize its ship, right? Repair those nuclear submarines and carriers and get them out. We need those 37,000 people trained, right? The right tools, the right layout of their shipyard to pump them through quickly. But it's also a strain on the industrial base on the construction side, because we haven't built things like this in a very long time. That last dry dock built at a public shipyard was finished in 1962. That's the year after the Nautilus was launched. Right, so we haven't done this in a long while. That's why I just blew the estimate on the very first one we restarted, because we had no history to go by. The good news, last one was finished in 1962. We have 3 new dry docks under construction at the public shipyards right now, renovating a 4th one for carriers in Norfolk. So we're back up. We finished $900 million, we love talking money, right? $900 million worth of projects. We renovated, you saw one of those dry docks. It was a beautiful dry dock in 1917. You know, once every 100 years, you better renovate your house. We've done that now. Dry dock 4 has got a sub in it, and I think it had a sub in it like the day after we cut the ribbon. So we are going now in its roofs, and it's also the stuff inside the industrial plant of equipment. We've bought about 300 pieces of new IPE. You got to have a TLA, right, a 3-letter acronym in the Navy. So we've put in the latest and greatest equipment to turn the metal, to be able to do these sorts of things. And I was with Congressman Kiggins, and very supportive in that. Hey, where's all that equipment made? Back to the office. Pleased to report 90% is manufactured in the United States. I mean, this is big, heavy stuff. The remaining 10%, Brazil, Germany, South Korea, thankfully. I was really afraid what that answer would be. But we are building now things on a scale that we haven't done in a very long time. So this is up at Kittery, Maine. We call it Portsmouth, right? But two congressional delegations for the price of one up there. So that's good. The casting yard for these things is 300 miles up the river. There are 200 miles up the river. There are 3 tower cranes just on the casting site to build these concrete monoliths, to float them down the river, and to put them in place. And you can you see the submarine in the back. That's still the active dry dock. We are refueling the USS Cheyenne inside the project site as we build. We will flood the dry dock 3 times. I think there's 5 ship movements in and out of the project site while we're doing the construction. So this is the scale that we are, rebuilding the industrial base on. That was the largest, most expensive contract ever done by the Navy. I wanted to name us BUDOCS, right? Bureau of Yards and Docks, take us way back in history, until we awarded this one out in Pearl Harbor. Virginia-class dry dock going in there to replace the functionally obsolete last LA class went through it. This thing is monstrous. What you see there on the left side, those are the floor sections, right? Circled there, I didn't show you the human on the other one. That's an F-150 circled for scale there. Gives you some sense. We're going to take those across, that's why Pia Point, take it across and sink those things 30 feet underwater. That's just the floor. We need 9 of them, the floor of that dry dock. The steel pipe manufactured in Houston, right? This is the scale through the Panama Canal. That was a trick with the low water level. We paid extra for that. Actually, the contractor did, because we did have firm fixed price on that portion of it. We're going to put that in there. And over at Waipea Point, you saw how constrained the site was at Portsmouth. We had to clear 60 acres of land just for the laydown site to be able to start stockpiling the material to take it over to the shipyard. By the way, when you're out there on the project site, right, you're at Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard, you're looking at Ford Island, the Missouri, the Arizona, and you do colors in the morning. That is not you got stuck by colors, right? You get to do colors there. All right, so that one's really cool. We're excited about it. It's 20%. The first one's 50%. This is 20% done. So, hey, why stop there? We have a single carrier dry dock on the West Coast right now, designed for Forrestal class, so maybe it's time to build a new one there. That largest project in the Navy, it's 1/4 of the size of what we need to build out at Puget Sound for the Ford-class carrier. And that's before you worry about the power requirements, the electrical requirement. The power feed for this thing is essentially $1 billion in itself, but without it, we don't dock the Ford out there. So it's absolutely essential we rebuild this. And I'll finish off again, as we are retraining ourselves to do it, the investment the nation is in making in our shipyards, in that organic industrial base, gives you a sense of what we're trying to accomplish in the uplift. And it's going to take years, because dry docks tend to suck the air out of the room, but then we have to get to the waterfront production facilities, those places where Susie and John work. And we've got to build those, because the efficiency gains are, right now, it's no fancy IT system. I'm a civil engineer, right? No business process re-improvement. Susie and Johnny just have to walk a long time in the shipyards to get their items, and we've got to shrink that all down. And that's enough for now. Thank you.
What a project. So I'm going to turn to Tom. You transitioned from the role of customer, the incredibly complex and important job of being the NAVSEA commander. Don't envy you for that. And now you're on the side of the provider. So you've really seen both sides of this challenging issue of defense industrial base. Now, since the early 2000s, the Navy's done a whole host of force structure assessment and has most recently concluded that it needs 381 ships. Despite those assessments, our actual fleet size has persistently hovered right around 300 ships for the last 20 years. That's an enormous gap when you think of it in percentage terms. So how do we get there, and what do we have to do, in addition to what Mark just described to us, to grow the size of the fleet if we're going to get there?
Yeah, well, thanks for the question, and it's great to be here. So I do want to start with Beach Charlotte, and I would remind the audience that the last time we had a major defense industrial base revolution was 1942, and in that year, Army started 6-0, and Navy started 5-0. So here we are in 2024 with Army at 6-0 and Navy at 5-0. So,
and the Army coach just gave Navy's football team some real grist for the bulletin board yesterday, if you saw that.
Yeah, so thank you for the question, and I will approach this kind of having said on both sides of the fence. So how we got here, it's actually pretty easy to explain. So coming out of the Reagan buildup, we had a very robust industrial base. We had, at the end of that, had built 5 aircraft carriers in a period of 17 years. We built 30 Los Angeles-class submarines in about 10 years. We were building on average about 2.5 destroyers per year. And Electric Boat actually delivered 14 Ohio-class submarines in a period of 13 years. So the industrial base was clicking along. And then the peace took place. And between 1993 and 2010, we ordered on average 5.5 ships per year. And between 1993 and 2027, and the reason I picked that is because that's 35 years, which is the lifespan of a DDG-51, which is kind of the average lifespan of most of our platforms, we have ordered 269 ships. So if you only order 269 ships over a 35-year period, you shouldn't be surprised that you're not going to get to 381 ships, much less the 313 ships that we first had as a number that Mike Mullen put in place when he was at CNO in the early 2000s. So, why did we only build 5.5 ships per year? There's a multitude of reasons for that. Clearly, some of those were driven by the budget and the desire to save money. I think, looking back at it, in hindsight, that the Navy probably made some poor decisions on some of the things they wanted to build. Littoral Combat Ship and DDG-1000, for instance, come to mind. I think what we wanted to build and the requirements for those, I think, caused us challenges. We've been looking to try and replace find the replacement for DDG-51 for at least the last 20 years, and we've had programs like CGX and DDGX and DD-21 and large surface combatant, and yet we've never been able to figure out exactly what we wanted. And then really kind of some from a cost realism standpoint, how much is it going to cost? And I think in many cases, because the budget was being driven down, we were unrealistic about what these ships were likely to cost. I use the analogy, if you're going to buy a car, probably the first thing you do before you actually even go out and buy a car is you think, well, how much do I want to pay for this car? And then you go to the dealer, and that kind of narrows your choices down. The Navy, on the other hand, what we start with is requirements. So here we want the ship to do the following things. And then we figure out what that's likely to cost. And so it's kind of like if you went into the Porsche dealer and you said, hey, I want a car that goes 0 to 60 in 2.4 seconds. I want the best sound system. I want the best handling. And you went down the line. The Porsche dealer is likely to say to you, well, it sounds like you want a Porsche 911 GTS RS. And you go, he'd take you over and show you the car, and you go, that's exactly what I want. And he goes, well, that'll be $375,000. And if you tell the Porsche dealer, hey, but I only have $120,000, he's not going to put his arm around you and say, let's figure out what we can do to get you into this car for $120,000. He's going to walk you down and say, we should go buy a Cayman. And unfortunately, the way we go buy ships, and this is really, between industry and the Navy, we kind of say, well, let's see what we can do to get us into that ship for $120,000 and hope everything goes perfectly. And it never does. And we end up with ships that cost a lot more than we expected, and all the attendant budget churn that goes along with that. So those are some of the reasons that got us where we are today. And we woke up in 2012 right after sequestration and realized that we had an industrial base which had, it's just supply and demand, had basically the demand signal had come down, and the industrial base sized itself to meet that demand signal. And we had about half the shipyards that we have today, and we had even worse on the tier 2 suppliers, the people that provide the pumps and the valves and the cabling. That number had gone down even more. In fact, on the submarine industrial base, the estimate is that we have 83% fewer suppliers today than we had back in 2000. And of those suppliers, 70% of them are sole source. So we created ourselves a structural problem that has to be addressed. And there's really, how do you address that? The solution sounds pretty simple, but it's really a matter of national will. So there are two key components to this. Look, if we really want to get to 381 ships, and we believe the force structure assessments, and this is what we're going to need to fight China and what we're doing today, and I'm a firm believer that those numbers are correct, we've got to be willing to commit the resources in order to build probably on the order of 12 to 14 ships a year, not the 5.5 ships that we have today. That's going to take real national will and real national commitment to do that. And that's a political issue, for the nation to go figure out whether we want to do it. I get told many times, well, we just can't afford to build 12 to 14 ships a year. And my answer to that is, of course, we can afford it. We spend billions and trillions of dollars on things in this nation every year that you could argue whether that's a good use of that money. But the reality is the nation has decided that's important to us. So if the nation is deciding that we're a maritime nation and that we need to be 381 ships for a lot of good reasons, and Admiral Caldwell, who's going to speak later, could probably give you a lot more than I can, then certainly we can afford it. So we've got to make a national commitment to afford it. Then the second piece of this is we need an industrial base that is sized to deliver you 12 to 14 ships per year. And that is actually going to be a little bit more challenging than you think. And I know some of the people on the panelists have discussed this previously. It's just not a matter of doubling the size of the workforce. We, in this country today, we have a national issue with manufacturing in general, not just in the shipbuilding area. And it's because for too long, we've been a service society, and we really, I think, have undervalued blue-collar manufacturing, electricians, pipe fitters, welders, to the point that we didn't hire many of those as we started downsizing the shipyards. And then when the senior people started to retire, we were left with a very junior workforce. To give you just one data point on this, in 1994, when we started this downsize, the average time in the shipyard of an electrical supervisor in the 4 major shipyards was 24 years. Today, the average electrical supervisor in the 4 major shipyards, 4.5 years. So I'll give you an idea of the challenge that we have to face. So we are going to have to take a generational approach to hiring workforce and pay them right and get them into this industry. And it's going to take time. It's not going to happen overnight. And it's going to be a whole of nation approach. The good news is, I think the government has recognized that. I think industry has recognized that. The industry has apprentice schools. I think the maritime industrial base funding that's out there, billions of dollars a year, is a really important first step to do that. Secretary Del Toro has done some partnerships with the state of Michigan, and I think we're going to have to do more of those things as we move forward if we want to grow the industrial base. Eventually, if you can get the industrial base you want, and we're willing to commit the funds we want, then we'll be able to get to 381 ships. And I look forward to your questions.
Okay, so as a reminder to the audience, we do have microphones. It'd be good to know if anybody has a question, but I have a couple of follow-up questions while you're making up your mind. And also, if you're online, I can see directly what you might type in there as your question, and I can accept it or reject it. But so the 381 ship number, which I agree is a solid number, is based on a particular warfighting concept. If we acknowledge that you have to have the national will, meaning means, and the infrastructure to produce that many ships, and you're not going to do it overnight. If we can't do that, as we've been unable to do it for the last 20 years, does that imply that we need to rethink the ways, that we need to rethink the warfighting concept under which that assumption is made? Anybody want to take that question?
Well, I think it's certainly an interesting question, and I'm not sure I would be the expert on in describing what the warfighting needs are of the Navy. But you could clearly make a case that if you were to change the mix of the platforms we have today, and there's a lot of discussion about how much these platforms cost and should we go to more unmanned. But I think there are a lot of people that argue today, in particular in the China fight, et cetera, that submarines are probably the preeminent fighting force, and that maybe we need more submarines. And so could you have a discussion about what the mix looks like? I think that you could. Obviously, I spent a lot of my career building aircraft carriers. I'm a big proponent of aircraft carriers and the what they provide to the countries too. But I think it's an interesting question, though I'm not sure I'm qualified to, at the end of the day, say what the force structure of the Navy should look like.
Yeah, but it is possible that if the conclusion were reached that, hey, we need a different concept here, could be a sea control concept instead of a power projection concept, that might actually shape the force differently, which would definitely trickle down to the industrial base. So you mentioned submarines, Tom. I'll open up to the panel. We have two sort of major yards that build surface ships. The submarine industrial base is under enormous pressure with Columbia, with AUKUS, with just trying to get Virginia submarines out the door. Would it make sense, would it be politically, physically, financially possible to shift one of those major surface ship yards to be a nuclear submarine yard?
You build them, I fix them.
Why is everybody staring at me?
And I'm not a submariner.
I would answer in a general term on the maintenance side, because we have that, more shipyards, more of everything. We can't afford what we have now. Let's think about it. I always ask people the classic dot mil PF. I'm the F guy. I'm the facility solution. That's the last one. You got to try everything else. Change your doctrine of how you're in a flight, your operation, deal something with people, bring in technology. Let me at least build on the existing shipyards. Failing all that, okay, then Hunters Point, Mare Island, something else, let's reopen it. But it's that trade-off of what other aspects you want to go after. Big and expensive, but money can't be just the only answer. How are you going to move those other levers in there? And that's just the Navy answer, right? How do you combine that with combined arms and other things, allies, to expand that a little bit more? So I think that just spend money may be the answer, but let's make sure we exhaust everything else.
Okay. Any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I would go back to some of what I said at the beginning. I think if you were to look at Electric Boat and what they do at Quonset Point and look at Newport News shipbuilding, I think the physical capacity exists here today. And as to my previous remarks, we built 10 Los Angeles class submarines in a period, 30 Los Angeles class submarines in a period of 10 years, and EB built 14 Ohio class in 13 years. So I think the numbers that we're talking about can be managed with the physical plants that we have today if we can grow the workforce. So I think the first place I would focus would be to let's reestablish the right workforce at the two nuclear yards we have today. I think that would be able to provide you the capacity that you need.
Can I follow up with one thing? And we heard it earlier today too. Hey, let the market forces do it, but what signal are we giving to industry that this is going to continue and it's worth investing? And I see that on the shipyard side. I need to give them predictable projects so they can staff up, people can enter that business because they know whatever the number is going to be, $2 billion, $2.5 billion a year is going to keep flowing to this. it's worth getting into this business. We say we're going to build a ship and then have 3 years without one. Yeah, why would you arm up?
Okay, so I'm going to keep asking questions till I see somebody standing at a microphone. Sort of for the larger, Carla and Cynthia and Luke as well. I want to ask a question about weapons. We were already short of weapons due to the services focusing on what I like to call identity metrics. Bob Work and I lived this in the 2014 timeframe when we were trying to get the services to buy more weapons, but they wanted force structure because that's how they're evaluated when they leave office, right? But meanwhile, we've been, as was suggested earlier, fighting in Ukraine. We haven't been fighting, but we've been supplying weapons to Ukraine, Israel. We've been expending an awful lot of high-end weapons in the Red Sea. So we're not only short, but we're expending them. Is the industrial base prepared to do this? When you ask a prime to, well, go ahead and shut down your Stinger line, and 10 years later you say, I need you to make 400 of these things. And literally the grandmothers who put them together have gone home. And the parts that are in those weapons are obsolescent. Are we properly configured, and are we aggressively enough approaching the weapons problem as well as the platform problem?
I mean, I'm happy to start if my panelists are so willing. And that's not just a made-up story that the Admiral just cited there with Stinger. I mean, that's actually what happened. Before I came to the department, I was working on the House Armed Services Committee staff. And while I didn't go out there for that trip myself because I wasn't dealing with the munitions account, my colleagues did and went out to Raytheon, right? And again, also having worked at Raytheon in the past, I was kind of familiar with what their limitations were. And I think that there's often a misunderstanding, I hate to say this, but I guess I can say it because I work in government, misunderstanding in both exec branch and ledge branch about some of the things that you gentlemen talked about and that you're hinting at here, that it's not just flipping a switch, right? Ramping up production and getting to where we're going to need to be to answer your question about backfill and then ensuring our own readiness and preparedness, we're looking at a fairly long, frankly, ramp here, right, to get ourselves to where we need to be. So I guess to zero in on your question, obviously that's part of my team's mission right now, right, is ensuring that we are going to get there. And I think everyone is hopefully aware that there's been a lot of focus on this effort over the past, especially 2.5 years since the Russians invaded Ukraine. And we've made a lot of investments, targeted investments through DPA, through IBAS in terms of where do we need to onshore some of those early inputs. We made a big investment in critical chemicals. I know a lot of people don't think about this and kind of, Admiral, what you were saying. At the end of the day, the warfighter wants his F-35 or wants his submarine or wants his tank, right? But we need the munitions. We need the platforms to fire them, but we need to think about all of those upstream inputs that are vital to actually building all of these weapon systems, which I don't think we focus on often enough. And granted, that's kind of our job, not necessarily your job. But without access to a secure source of those critical materials and minerals, we're not going to get there on backfilling munitions and ensuring that we're postured for whatever may come in the Indo-Pacific region. So I guess I would just say we're not there yet. I do think, though, that we have a fairly solid plan to get there. I would also give one more plug because I kind of just dissed on both my own branch of government and ledge branch. I will say that Congress granting multi-year procurement authority for munitions was a really big step. And you got to give the department and my boss's boss, Dr. LaPlante, credit for working with the Congress to make that a reality. We often have used multi-year procurement to buy things like ships, like aircraft. Using it for missiles and munitions was a different concept. We haven't, again, that is still sort of in the early stages, but we have already let first few contracts in order to buy those missiles and munitions at scale and hopefully reap some cost benefits, but also really the utility of multi-year procurement authority in this instance is to send that demand signal to industry that that the funding is going to be there and the demand to buy these systems is going to be there, and it won't be boom or bust like it really has been in munitions over quite some time.
Really important point. Sandy, did you have a quick addition?
Since this is a history conference, I will remark that having worked on these topics for almost 30 years, the challenges in the munitions industrial base, they're not new. Dr. Roper was on record as saying that there's underinvestments and that the trades are made to plug holes in acquisition programs by taking from munitions. Secretary Kendall did as well when he was AT&L. So these are long-standing challenges and problems. Finally, we have the right kind of attention. So the question for all of us in this room is, how do we make sure that we are thinking about munitions in 5 years, in 10 years, when maybe at a time when we have deterred, when we are at peace, we still need those investments. We can't continue to take risk.
Good point. Okay, we're going to turn to a lightning round now. And so we have, I know, at least 2 questions. I'm going to start on the left. A question, please, not a statement. And a very quick answer, please. So starting with you, sir.
So my questions are about shipbuilding capacity. And I think, in World War II, we won the war not just by the force that we went in, but by our ability to replenish, repair, and expand the force in the fight. So my questions are around, well, I read earlier this year that China has 72 times the shipbuilding capacity of the United States. And Daniel Yergin this morning mentioned it was a number he heard that was 212 times. And that just sounds like an overwhelming number. And I don't know what that number represents. I suspect it may just be commercial shipbuilding capacity. But when you think about numbers like that, do you see that as vital that we close a gap of that magnitude? Is it even possible? How do we do that when we have all the issues that Admiral Winnefeld, you mentioned, like the trades earlier today? And or does trying to close a gap like that perhaps take a lot of resources away from other national priorities?
Let me throw that one to Luke and ask you the poignant question of, would we ever buy ships from foreign suppliers to latch on top of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an incredibly important and urgent question. I mean, I think it's hard to imagine quickly getting to anything approaching parity with Chinese shipbuilding in the domestic United States, right? I mean, because we just don't really have the vast commercial shipbuilding industry that the Chinese have that feeds into their defense shipbuilding, we really don't have in this country, right? However, we do have some advantages in that we can draw on allies and partners who actually do have very robust shipbuilding industries, like South Korea, like Japan. I think this question of onshoring versus ally shoring, friend shoring, obviously there's a debate going on right now about just the maintenance of naval vessels in Japan. There are negotiations that are ongoing. There are also voices that are raised in opposition, right? There is opposition from some U.S. shipbuilders, right? Some industry interests, and it's I won't weigh in on either side of the discussion, but I think it is very much a live debate.
And the regulatory environment for U.S. shipbuilders is highly uncompetitive with those folks. And you might consider a threshold where you guarantee a certain amount of work for domestic shipyards, but once that's surpassed, you can go outside. All right, on the right, sir.
My name is Hampton Dell. I'm a consultant. Interesting discussion about a lot of wants and needs and desires and a lot of forward-looking. And we have a new industrial-based resilience plan that was released, but the implementation plan was supposed to be in March. Now it'll be coming out almost a year later. We're now going through we have a different defense budget every 2 to 4 to 6 years.
And it's late.
And and now we're all sorts of extended funding and so forth. We don't, I believe, I may be wrong, but I think we're the only top-tier country that doesn't have a national defense strategy that's actionable. It's very policy-driven. There's nothing in the strategy that one could say, this needs to be funded at what course and time, at what amount, at what balance, to what benefit. And, in business, you have a strategy, folds into a business plan, and you move forward. Very hard in government. But maybe with understanding the realities that we have today, would it be possible, would it be beneficial for industry and government to sit down and come up with an actionable defense strategy that lasts for maybe 6 to 7 years, that could be funded so that industry can actually react inventories can stand up. It's not going to be perfect because the world changes. But on the other hand, right now, all we're doing is reacting to vulnerabilities.
Let's get to the answer. Carla, can you give us a quick answer on
Sure.
that?
I mean, I hate to be Debbie Downer here, but we do live in the United States and our fabulous democracy where we have a presidential election every 4 years. And, we are maybe in an unhelpful dynamic right now where, I think there used to be maybe a little more consensus on foreign policy issues, and maybe we've diverged a little bit from that. I will say, however, I think there's a lot of bipartisan or apolitical interest in industrial-based resilience. Sorry, not to go too long, but I mean, this administration has done a tremendous amount of work. There have been multiple executive orders came out of the White House. And then, like I said, we released a strategy, now we're doing implementation. But, in all fairness, the last administration started the deep dive on supply chains, and we built on that work. So I don't expect that to go away. But to your point, just really quickly, we have, trying not to take up too much time, but in developing the implementation, the strategy, industrial-based strategy, and the implementation plan, we have done quite a bit of engagement with industry, and we have tried to make sure that we have spanned the spectrum to the degree possible, right? Not just talking to, RTX and Lockheed, but making sure that we've talked to Anduril, talked to some of the emerging space companies, talked to some folks who are working in data. So that was pretty important to our leadership. The other thing I would just highlight real quickly is that, with regard to, I'm not here to defend the National Defense Strategy, but of course there is a classified implementation to that. What we're doing on the industrial-based strategy is really a bit of an anomaly for DoD. DoD doesn't, my colleagues here can correct me, but putting out an unclass implementation is pretty unusual. It's proven a big challenge for us, but that's why it's very important for some of the reasons that you hit on, right? Is that we need to be able to telegraph to the defense industrial base where we think the priorities are headed, where we think resources should follow, and hopefully where they can co-invest with us.
Okay, I'm told I have a couple extra minutes. I would add to that, as vice chairman, I was consistently scolded by senators, certain senators, for submitting a budget-based strategy, to your point. And Bernard Brodie said, famous quote in my mind, strategy comes with a dollar sign. And interestingly, the Australian Ministry of Defense pointedly submits what they call a budget-based strategy. So go take that any way you want to. We have a question on the right.
Adam Volman with Beacon Global Strategies. Just a quick question. You mentioned upstreaming in terms of minerals, but how does that relate to energy? We had our last panel on energy production. Is there a prerogative from the DoD to increase domestic energy production to meet the needs of the defense industrial base?
Quick answer, please.
Yeah, I'm not sure that, we're focused specifically on, are you speaking about energy needs here domestically? Or, we do have, the executive order that we've kind of used as the foundation for the defense industrial strategy does have energy and battery storage as one of the main areas of focus. And I will say the Department of Defense, Department of Energy, Commerce have put a lot of effort towards this issue. That's not quite, what you're asking, right? There are investment authorities in other parts of the federal government that are focused on that. This is just my personal opinion, I suppose. I think you've hit on a very important point that we need to be thinking about as we're looking at about what operations are going to need to look like, in the Indo-Pacific region, considering just all the factors there.
Okay, on my left, sir.
David Miller. Since we're talking history, the 1919 collapse and bankruptcy of a lot of companies because of the way contracting worked meant that in the late 1930s, companies were unwilling to increase the size of their investment. So the government came up with a system based on GOCOs, government-owned, company-operated companies, not companies, but facilities. And those seem to have done a good job of taking the risk away from the companies as long as they were willing to provide large numbers of people to actually operate the companies. Is there any discussion of going to that sort of system?
I think that would require a national mobilization and an understanding of a national emergency and a level of threat that we have not yet grappled with.
I'll just add, too, that one of the problems with that model, and you see it with the GOCO facilities that we have today, we were just talking about modernizing the organic industrial base, right? Why is it that these facilities need such extensive recapitalization and modernization, right? It could be that that GOCO model has drawbacks where you don't have the same level of capital investment that you do get with privately owned industrial facilities. So I think there are trade-offs to consider here as well.
If I can add, we are changing the paradigm of the construction contract. It used to be firm fixed price, that's all we're doing at the size we're doing now. The government's taking on much more of the economic risk. We're working with the construction contractors during the design to understand how you would build it, where are your risks, how the government can remove that. That's something we never have done in the construction world before. Here are the plans, bid it, give us your price, and then live by it. You can't do that for 7 years. Also, we released an RFI on Tuesday to see, my words, who would like to go halvesies with us on a floating dry dock on the West Coast. We're going to build one really big one, but if maybe somebody can bring in another stream of money to fix MSC ships, tankers, cruise liners, something, and then the Navy would have access to it as well. So we're looking for something that we call PPV. You could call it GOCO if you wanted to.
Okay.
So as for a quick two-finger, because I just want to compare where we are now to 1939 and the Freedom's Forge model. So we reinstituted our industrial base in World War II, but we had high levels of unemployment thanks to the, well, no thanks to the Depression, but because of the Depression, so a lot of labor. We had empty factories. We had a much larger manufacturing industrial base, and systems were much simpler. They were much less complex. There weren't really semiconductors on World War II ships, so the whole manufacturing challenge was very different. So if we are going to surge industrial base today, those are some additional challenges that we would have to deal with.
Okay, if we can ask the questions quickly and give the answers quickly, we got time for two more. So, Ensign.
Jack Montgomery, Ensign, U.S. Navy. For long-range, anti-surface, anti-air weapons, can these munitions get cheaper other than multi-year buys?
Well, in general, the more you build of something, the more the price, there's a fixed cost associated with building anything. So, I think just like with computers, through technology, I think you'll drive the cost down, but the cost, it will generally come down to most anything you're buying in commodities when you buy it in larger quantities. So I know you're probably studying this more, but to the missiles that you're talking about building, very complex. The initial cost will be pretty high, but historically we'll bring those down as we buy more.
And if you can keep the requirements under control, that's the challenge.
don't change.
Is they'll, people will layer on top more and more requirements, and they start to get very expensive. But where the I think Luke, you mentioned the new entrants in the field, they're sort of passing through the peak of inflated expectations, and they're entering the trough of disillusionment, and now they're going to hopefully level off. But there is some potential there where they can, if they're asked to do simple enough things, they can bring their Silicon Valley expertise and potentially produce something like that.
So, and on that exact note, Anduril claims that its Barracuda family of missiles, which is just announced, can be constructed for, I think, 20% of the cost of the average cruise missile the U.S. military is procuring. Will that hold up? I don't know, right?
Okay. Our last question, sir.
Commander Massengale, visiting military fellow at the Simpson Center. Respect to the CNO's NAV plan, it offers 7 points with criteria that generally is effective, evaluating how effective they are, with the exception of kind of infrastructure. It really states we will repair critical infrastructure with a condition of poor or less. How would you assess, what would be your metric to judging if you're effectively meeting the CNO's objective to repair our infrastructure?
Sure. We have one that specifically measures condition. I think the shipyards are poor right now, to no one's surprise. So that's what's pushing it up. We've got 14 KPPs that I have to answer to. The main ones are throughput on the shipyards. Let's get the ships through at the right time. We have condition of the equipment, condition of the facility, so it lines exactly with the NAV plan. And to bring it home, energy resiliency and basically seismic and flood resiliency also, because we've had a long-standing requirement to be able to island for 14 days our critical infrastructure, and we need to get the shipyards to that. putting a small modular reactor where we have, small modular reactors floating on sea might be the perfect use case for what we heard in the last discussion as well.
All right, I think we are out of time. Excellent job, panel. Please join me in thanking our panelists for... And I think the Secretary of the Navy is the next...
Yeah, the Secretary of the Navy was supposed to be the next one, but we have breaking news on that. But first of all, I want to thank Admiral Winnefeld and our distinguished panel. Thank you so much. It's a hot topic, topic of great interest, and I think you all did a great job of just sharing your views on where we stand with the defense industrial base. So thank you all very much. As a small token of our appreciation, yes, we're giving out the same book today, The Neptune Factor by Nicholas Lambert, for all of you. So thank you so much. And then another round of applause, please.